Frequently asked questions about the Montessori method of education. And you've probably already seen the subtitle, which is, do I really need all that stuff? And the answer is a little bit complicated. If you have a child that you want to use Montessori principles with at home because your child is in a Montessori school, no, you do not need all that stuff. You need a few things to make your home more accessible for your child's independence, and you may want to have some things that are along the line of some of the Montessori learning materials that your child has access to school at home as well. If you are doing homeschooling, if you're doing a Montessori school, then yes, you do need a lot of stuff, but perhaps not as much as you might think if you have been wandering around the blogs and the websites that are available to help people to do Montessori education. Now, I'm going to go through a few different aspects of this. I'm going to start with where I started with parents who have their children at home or not planning to do Montessori education at home, but want to support what their children are getting at a Montessori school. And no, you don't need things that your child has at school. That's why they're there. That's why they have them available to use in that environment. What I would suggest is that you look at your home for where your child is not able to do things on his or her own that would be appropriate. If your child can't reach places they need to, bathroom sinks, kitchen counters for them to help you in the kitchen, then stools or other pieces of furniture to help them to be able to be independent are very appropriate. If their rooms aren't organized in a way where they can manage them, take care of their own belongings, put their own belongings away, furniture, ways of storing toys, books, clothing that the child can manage, those things definitely are worthwhile looking into. And we'll talk about those more in other segments. That is more about a Montessori-friendly home than the Montessori stuff. This episode is about all that stuff. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is, well, what about all that stuff? Where does it all come from, and how do I sort it out? It seems like every time I go on one of those websites, there's another set of free printables. What's that about? Do you have to print stuff out every day? What is all this stuff? Well, I'm going to break it down into three parts. One is the Montessori learning apparatus, the didactic apparatus, the original Montessori materials. If you are watching this video, it's very likely that you have at least seen photographs of a pink tower. You've probably seen some of the math materials, such as the golden bead material. Those things are Montessori learning apparatus, the original pieces that Dr. Montessori used in her schools, or possibly slight variations upon them. And I'm going to suggest that if you are doing Montessori in a school setting or in a homeschool co-op where your child is not going to a Montessori school in conjunction with what you're doing at home, yes, you do need those things. And this is one of the reasons that you may have heard me say in other places, if you're going to do Montessori at home, I strongly suggest you look into a co-op situation. Particularly with some of the sensorial materials, those are things that children will use and use intently for a small period of time and then quickly move beyond. So if you are attempting to buy all of the sensorial Montessori materials, that's going to be a large outlay. That's going to be a large outlay of money for you, even if you're doing it wisely, and I will have some resources on my website about how to do that. If you're going to do that, having some sort of a cooperative arrangement with other homeschooling families is something I strongly suggest, so that your child does have access to all of those sensory materials, all of the range of materials that Dr. Montessori designed, not just to teach your child stuff, not just to teach your child skills, but to help your child to develop his or her personality, to help your child to develop sensory awareness that we're just beginning to understand how it may serve those higher learning skills. So in terms of the Montessori apparatus, if your child has only your home or only your school as the exposure to those things, yes, you need them. So that's the first category of Montessori stuff. Now, even within that category, I'm going to suggest that you strongly consider confining yourself to the things that Dr. Montessori used, particularly for children ages 3 to 6. In the elementary classroom, there are some specific substitutions that I do consider to be appropriate for reasons that I've gone into in some other places. I won't delve into that too much here, because right now I want to make sure that if you're considering doing Montessori, you realize it's very easy to understand from things that are available on the internet. It's very easy to think you have to make a whole lot of things and you have to have a whole lot of things that are well beyond the original set of materials that Dr. Montessori herself used. So I am going to suggest that using the research that's been done, Dr. Angeline Lillard, one of the most well-respected Montessorians in terms of compiling the science that supports Dr. Montessori's ideas, as well as doing original research that has helped us to understand some of those ideas. She has done a research project where she polled training centers that are associated with two of the major Montessori associations, Association Montessori International, the association most commonly the association most commonly considered to be the one that Dr. Montessori left to continue on her legacy, and the American Montessori Society. And when Dr. Lillard polled these different societies, these training centers and trainers associated with these two societies, she found some places where there was some disagreement of what was needed, but she found a lot of agreement. And that list of materials is where I would consider that your homeschool co-op or your school start, and that you realize that when you've done that, you've done most of what you need to do. Not all, and we'll talk a little bit more about some other categories, but here is the place that I'm going to ask that you trust the ongoing success of Montessori schools that have confined themselves to a smaller number of materials than what a lot of people consider to be necessary or desirable today. So that's the first set, the Montessori apparatus. Now the second set of materials I'm going to call second generation Montessori materials, or expansions of the original set of apparatus. A lot of people watching this video are probably familiar with the 100 board. The 100 board is simply a chart that has 10 rows across, 10 rows down. The numbers from 1 to 100 are entered into the chart horizontally, so the number 1 is up in the top left corner, the number 10 is up in the top right corner, and then each row is one more set of numbers until in the far bottom right corner you have the number 100. Now that is a 100 chart. The 100 board is simply a blank board with the squares for those numbers, and then 100 tiles. A lot of homeschooling Montessori families may even make the tiles from paper, simply make a 100 chart and then cut it into the 100 pieces to be laid out on a board. That is one of those materials that I consider to be a second generation Montessori material, because there's a lot of evidence that it's not necessary. There's even anecdotal evidence that I'm aware of that Dr. Montessori herself didn't think it was a useful piece of material. So that's one of those things where I would say, if you have a really good reason to put it in your environment, in addition to or especially in place of something, then it's an appropriate material to have. But I am going to encourage you to think very long and hard before you replace anything that Dr. Montessori herself used, especially for children ages 3 to 6 and even throughout the elementary years. Because of the amount of research and the amount of success that she developed, I think that that's a very important consideration. So in terms of second generation Montessori materials, think carefully before you go there. Now the last set of materials that I'm going to talk about are what I would call the paper materials. Now in this regard, there are definitely some things that either are very much used in conjunction with the original Montessori apparatus or are a natural extension of them. An example of the first are math problems to use with the Montessori math materials. Particularly with some of the Montessori math materials, there is only so far in a in a math problem that you can go and have the materials work. If you have a number with 10,000 in it, you can't use the stamp game with it, at least not without some major workarounds. So that would be one of the places that I think it's very appropriate to say, yes, I do need some paper support materials to make sure that those apparatus materials can be used independently. Another place that I think that the paper materials are essential is for language learning. Now, if your child is learning English, which there's a good chance of that if you're listening to this video, I do believe that the complex phonetic patterns of the English language require something beyond the sandpaper letters, the movable alphabet, and the writing materials such as the metal or geometric insets that Dr. Montessori endorsed. If your child is learning to read Spanish or Italian, that may be sufficient. But if English is the language that you're teaching, there are complex phonetic patterns that paper materials are very helpful in teaching and explaining to your child. Now, I will go into those in other places, but those are the places I think it's very, very essential. Now, if you are teaching children ages 3 to 6, there are other paper materials that I think can be appropriate. 3-part cards, which are the cards that have a control card or a card that shows both an image and a word that goes with it, a mute card, which is the image alone, and the label card, which is the word alone. Those can be very, very appropriate. They can also be overdone. Now, in the area of the cultural materials, maps, things used in conjunction with the puzzle map materials, those are all very, very appropriate to use with the children. And I'm not going to encourage you to eschew paper or paper materials in those areas either. But the last half of this discussion of paper materials is about all the things that you don't need. And if you've watched some of the other episodes, you've heard me talk about opportunity cost. I think that's the most important reason not to make a lot of paper materials that you don't need. The second most important reason is it is overwhelming to the person, the adult who prepares the environment. Now, if you have materials that you switch out once a month just because you want the colors of the Valentine's holiday or the St. Patrick's Day holiday and little symbols to go with that, I'm going to suggest you're doing too much. And I'm going to suggest that you're distracting the children from the materials that are really going to serve them the best. So as you look at all of those paper materials out there, all those printables, all those free printables, please remember 3 things in approximately descending order of importance. Number 1, what is your child not working with when they work with that Valentine's work or that St. Patrick's Day work? Number 2, what are you not doing when you're making that work? What personal preparation, what mindfulness practices for yourself or self-care practices such as exercise, movement, time in nature, fixing foods that you enjoy and that are healthy for you. Which of those practices, as well as reading Dr. Montessori's own materials, Dr. Montessori's own words to help you to truly give your child a Montessori education, which of those things are you not doing while you're making all those printables? And the last is a practical consideration. Have you priced it out? A lot of people that I know buy an awful lot of color toner. And one of the reasons is that most of these printables use a lot of color toner. Have you added up the cardstock and the color toner and maybe the laminating film, plus your time to print them out, laminate them, cut them out, find a material to display them on, find a container to display them on? Those are the reasons that I'm going to suggest, no, you don't need all that stuff. If your child isn't in a Montessori material, do you need some really significant, potentially expensive materials? Yes, you do. But you don't need all that stuff. Whenever you're ready.
Hi, I'm Bob Valalonga, and this is David Valalonga. We developed Montessori.org. It's an online Montessori resource. It's free to use for teachers, parents, anyone else who wants to get on there. And it's full of Montessori albums that have the presentation and the purpose of those Montessori album entries. And like for example, the binomial cube, you can send it to your parents, the Montessori students, and they can understand what a binomial cube teaches their student. So most parents don't have a full understanding of all the Montessori curriculum out there. So we also have over 500 worksheets and printouts that are available to download for free off the website. The entire website's free to use, and we just pay for it off of advertising on the website. And we also have a newsletter that we offer for free. You can subscribe on our website. So you can check us out at Montessori.org.
We've talked in some other episodes about finding materials for inexpensive costs. I've specifically mentioned and showed some of the materials that I've gotten at thrift stores because they're beautiful, lots of times nice wood boxes, sometimes with nice lids, baskets, things like that I've been able to get for much less than what they would be new. And I definitely recommend that. I have been spending a lot of our time in our episodes recently on the idea of priorities and pitfalls. And so I'm going to address a little bit of both of those with this segment, which is how do you make the best use of the dollar stores, the dollar aisle at some stores. Target is always a popular one in my experience of interacting with people on the Facebook boards and some of my other internet friends. And so how do you decide what's worth your while there? Before I talk about that, I am going to mention that the first thing you need to make sure is that you're not spending more of your time there than you should. So I'm going to suggest that if you are just going there with an open-ended, oh, let's just see what I can find, and with no budget and with no classroom problems in mind, it's probably not the best use of your money or your time. So I'm going to suggest that one of the ways that you make the best use of those places is by having a list. And I would suggest that the list have two parts to it. One is specific things you know you need. So perhaps you are putting together some cutting jobs in a classroom, and you need a small cutting board, or you need a knife that works well in a child's hand or something like that. Those kinds of supplies could be listed very specifically on your list. Or you need a container of this size for these cards or for these objects. I need a small basket, I need a big basket, etc. That would be the top of your list. Then I would suggest that you have a second part of your list, which is problems in the classroom. You know, I'm having difficulty guiding the children to choose work in the botany area. I've noticed that I'm giving verbal suggestions. It feels a little intrusive. How am I going to give them some ideas of things that they can do in the botany area? When I mention things, they seem interested in them, but I want them choosing those things on their own. So self-initiated work in the botany area might be one of the problems that you're seeking to solve, or something that you see as a need in your classroom. With this kind of list in mind, I think that you're going to find that your time will be much better spent. So let's have some specifics. Let's see what kinds of things I think are worth choosing from the dollar aisles. Those of you who do frequent Target might recognize this item, probably would recognize the sticker. These are tiny whiteboards, and this is a package of 4 of them, and I think this is a very worthwhile item. I have found in most classrooms at one time or another, you're in a position where you're being asked to give children the correct spelling of words. You may be asked to give them other things, such as the correct formation of a letter, or You know, you drew a puppy the other day. Would you show me how to draw the puppy's nose and mouth again? There's all kinds of possibilities, but primarily you may be asked to give them words. Now, in some other segments, I'll talk about a whole system for doing that involves keeping the children visual with their spelling, but this is a great step. You can then write the word out for the child, hand it to them. They can go back, copy it onto their work, into a personal dictionary, whatever system you have recommended to them, and it's a very effective way to give them that word in a visual way, which, if you know very much about my recommendations of spelling, you know is something that I highly suggest. So I think these are a good choice. Let's see what else. Now, some things may not be obvious. Okay, so this is a giant paperclip. Why would that be a good choice in my classroom? Well, this falls into what I mentioned as a way to solve problems in the classroom. One of the best ways that you can keep from intruding on the children is by changing the environment. And this is a way to post things in the environment without saying anything at all that can serve a lot of different purposes. One of those purposes might be to provide a reference. So I do believe that the Getty-Dubé writing style, this is the basic italic, or kind of their equivalent of print, and then the cursive italic down here. This is a reference sheet that I might have sitting on the shelf. It might be that the children would take it with the stand. Also, I might actually make this 2 different charts. I might cut this in half and mount it, cut it out of the book, then mount it on a piece of cardstock so that the clip is not interfering with part of it, and then have a separate one for the cursive. This would be a way that the child could just take the whole thing. Could also be laminated or be in a page protector and be something that the child could take with them to their seat. Another option would be some behavioral guidance. These happen to be some strategies that a class that I worked with came up with for a problem that the children acknowledged was creating difficulties in the class, that they were not keeping the sound level peaceful enough that others were able to concentrate on their work. So we looked at the problems. Why is it too loud? We've got mostly voices. That was what it came up with, and that's what these were addressing, which is to keep yourself quiet to start with. Don't try to talk over people. So if you're at a table and you're able to notice that your voice is getting louder because your friend's voice is loud, that you would make a conscious choice not to do that. That, by the way, is very tricky for 6 to 9-year-old children, but it was a valid strategy for us to include. Use a self-help strategy to stay quiet or silent. In this particular situation, it was necessary for children to be silent at different times, some of their transitions, things like that. And so we came up with some signals that worked for different children. To put your hand over your mouth, kind of a universal signal that also signaled to other friends in the hallway that it wasn't appropriate to be speaking in the hallway. Putting a bubble in your mouth. This is something that some of the children had learned in their class the year before, which is basically pretending you have a bubble in your mouth, and if you have your cheeks puffed out with your pretend bubble, you can't talk. And this was one we added later on, stand, sit, or work near people you talk with less. So we actually had the children taking that responsibility to go and sit in places where they were not as likely to want to visit with their nearby neighbors. Give and use signals from friends to go back to quiet or silence. So the signal for silence was this, and then the signal for quiet was to kind of bring their voice level down. If the signals and strategies above don't work, silent time. And I don't like to use silent time, but it is a strategy that I found worked, especially when the class needed to reset. So one of the things that we did is we gave the instruction that when they would leave a group time, we had to have a group time for some announcements each morning, that then what the children would do is as they went to choose their first work or return to work that they already had out, that they would purposely choose to be silent so that they didn't just habitually fall into chit-chat, which is what I called unnecessary conversation. So that's a way that something from the dollar aisle could help solve a problem you'd already determined in your classroom. Now, I've also mentioned that having, in some of the other segments, that having materials that the children can use independently to do research is useful. This dinosaur book, I would not say is completely accessible to an early elementary, to all early elementary children, certainly not, but to a lot, but it would be accessible to many, and certainly would be more accessible than a lot of books on dinosaurs. So this is a reading level 2, grades 1 through 3, but it is good, solid facts about the dinosaurs. A dollar book, very, very worthwhile in the classroom. Now, I have used a lot of different cards from the dollar aisle for different things. Some of them are just fairly discrete pieces of information, maybe an animal card with a picture on the front and then just a little bit about the animal on the back that can be used as vocabulary enrichment cards, other kinds of cards in the classroom. This is one that I found on a recent trip, which is a dinosaur trivia game. The questions are up at the top and the answers are at the bottom, so obviously this is something that would be done with a friend. Brachiosaurus is believed to have consumed 440 pounds of this each day. Well, the answer is plants. That's a pretty easy one. Some of them are not easy. True or false, the Dinosaurus reaping lizard had claws that were 3 feet long. Well, I probably didn't even pronounce that one correctly. So this is one of the points that I'm going to make. I do believe this could be worthwhile in the classroom, but I would not just stick it on the shelf. If you don't have any resources for the children to know about the Dinosaurus or even how to pronounce its name, it doesn't belong there. So you can use some things like this, but do so carefully. This one's probably got a little bit more accessible information that you maybe can feel pretty confident that the child can either find in the classroom or that you've already presented. So use those dollar resources, use the thrift store resources, but use them reasonably. Skip a lot of the plastic. Skip all the little doodads that you haven't figured out what you're going to do with when you put them in your cart. Have a list. Have some things, some needs in your classroom that you're consciously addressing, and then go and shop wisely.